Good morning. My name is Susan Mark. I'm the Outreach Librarian at the Wyoming State Library, and I would like to welcome you to Intro to Podcasting. This is part one of our two-part Podcasting 101 series. If you haven't yet, I'd encourage you to sign up for the workshop we have on Friday. And with that, I want to introduce our presenters for the day. And this event will be recorded, so if you get called away from your desk and can't watch the whole thing, you'll be able to see it afterwards on our YouTube channel. Our two presenters these days are Cameron Grain, and Cameron is the art show coordinator for the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum, and he's the technical producer of the Saddalore podcast, which is a history podcast about Cheyenne and Cheyenne Frontier Days. He's also an adjunct professor of history at Laramie County Community College. And we also have Skye Cranny. Skye is a history PhD student at Southern Methodist University in Texas. She's an employee of the Idaho State Historical Society and a co-host of the Behind Gray Walls podcast, which is about inmates of the old Idaho State Penitentiary. She currently splits her time between Dallas, Texas, and Boise, Idaho. And with that, I am going to hand this over to Skye, and we can get started. Skye, you're on.
All right. Good morning, everyone. So let me just make sure that we can get this going here. All right, so hopefully everyone can see that. All right, so let me just introduce myself a little bit. And Cameron, will you let me know, can you see everything looking okay?
Yeah, everything's looking good on my side.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so I'll just introduce myself a little bit. Again, my name is Skye Cranny. I was born and raised in Boise, Idaho. And I'm currently a history PhD student at Southern Methodist University. I got my BA in history at Utah State University, and I got my MA in history at the University of Wyoming, which is where I met Cam. And my field of study right now is currently gender, film, and culture in the early 20th century U.S., but I also have a really great passion for Idaho history since I was born and raised there, and that's also obviously demonstrated in the podcast that I co-host, which is the Behind Gray Walls podcast. And so just to give you a little background of that, so I, for the year between my MA and my PhD, I was working at the old Idaho State Penitentiary Historical Site, which is a division of the Idaho State Historical Society. And while I was there for a year, my main project was researching the 216 women inmates who served throughout the prison's history. And I had to create one-page biographies for all of these inmates. And as I did that, I just found every story was worth knowing and worth telling. And I really felt the world should know about these incredible women. And so at the end of 2018, I worked with a coworker. His name is Anthony, and I'll kind of bring Anthony up a little bit throughout my side of the presentation. And so together we imagined and created Behind Gray Walls, which, as Susan mentioned, it profiles the inmates, the men and women who serve time behind the prison walls there. So let's get started. First, what is a podcast? I'm guessing if you're here, you probably already know, but if you don't know, the Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines a podcast as a program, as of music or talk, made available in digital format for automatic download over the internet. You can also read that one definition below. Cameron actually wrote that, and it's very smart. It's a great definition about podcasts as contact zones wherein curators can interpret cultural material. I'm not quite in my semester yet, so I'm not ready to be that smart. So instead, if you don't mind, maybe we'll start a little bit more simply as to why a podcast might be the best route to go, as well as how to decide what topic might make the best kind of podcast in your case. So the first question that you might want to ask yourself is, why a podcast? Why choose to do a podcast over other things like blogs or social media blasts? And I think all formats have their advantage, but in my opinion, podcasts are the way to go. From my own personal experience, when I want to learn about a new subject or just want to think about something new, finding a blog can be useful, but reading can take up time that I was planning to use for something else. And honestly, as a graduate student, I read so much for school that the last thing I want to do is to read more, and that's just because I'm lazy. So instead, I try to find podcast episodes. I think podcasts can have a personal touch that blogs or social media posts can't quite replicate. I think for me, hearing a human voice has a much greater impact than just reading some words on a computer screen. But most importantly, podcasts are incredibly popular right now. So there's a group, they're called Edison Research, and they're a group designed to collect data about digital technologies. And they found that an estimated 144 million people listened to podcasts in 2019, up from 124 million in 2018. And you can see from this chart that podcasts have continued to steadily gain in popularity since 2006. And then if you take a look at these statistics, that millions of, it's not just like a few thousand more, it's millions of people, more people are listening and are aware of podcasting as the years go by. And I think having a medium that has in it a world that is so technologically advanced, and it continues to advance, to think about the fact that podcasts have been around since 2006, whereas things like streaming on Netflix in 2006 was unthinkable. So the fact that podcasts have continued to become more popular within the last 13 years, I just think there's no better time than now to create a podcast. And especially given, the COVID times that we're living in, people have a lot of extra time on their hands that they're looking to fill with something new. They're looking to learn something new, something like that. So another reason to do a podcast, it's not that just it's popular, but it's easy. Well, it's easy for the listeners. It's not as easy for you as the producers. It's actually kind of hard and stressful during the production phase, but podcasts are an easy way for producers and consumers to engage with each other in a way that even places like museums and libraries cannot do in the same way. I might argue that podcasts are one of the easiest mediums through which to convey information that you as the producer want to get across to your audience. And there are a few reasons for that. So first, podcasts are easy to access for consumers. Most smartphones these days have some kind of preloaded podcast app already on the phone, and if they don't, there are several other podcast apps that they can download to start listening to in just a matter of minutes, even for the most technology challenged of us. So, for example, just the other day, I was actually talking to a granddaughter of a female inmate that we were going to interview on the podcast, and she's probably in her 60s or 70s, and she said, my daughter has tried to tell me what a podcast is, and I guess I don't really get it, but I want to listen to it. Can you tell me how to find it? And so over the phone, within 10 minutes, I was actually able to help her to subscribe to Behind Gray Walls through the Apple Podcasts app. But many listeners, as we saw in the previous graphs, will already be familiar with podcasts. And so according to that same Edison Research Group, in 2019, 70% of surveyed people had some kind of familiarity with podcasts. So again, it's very easy for people to access. And another reason that I think podcasts are easy is similarly related to the previous point. They are easy to consume. Unlike a movie, a TV show, a museum, or a library, listeners can listen to podcasts when they're just doing their normal routine. So I like to listen when I'm getting ready for the day or making dinner. I don't have to make any special time to listen to them. And I think also the best and most accessible part of podcasts is that they are free to most listeners. No one will have to spend any extra money to be entertained or to be more educated. And I think in a COVID and post-COVID world, having a medium that is free is going to be an enormous asset for your podcast. So given my audience, I will assume, and if I'm incorrect, I apologize, but that most of us want to start a podcast for educational reasons. And podcasts are a great platform for educating, especially when used as an extension of other exhibits at our museums or libraries or institutions. So when Anthony and I started our podcast, we wanted it to be a supplement to what people learned when they visited the Old Idaho Penitentiary site. Visitors' learning can continue even after they left. And I think that is a super important point. that, even once people leave our museum or our library or whatever our institution is, their learning doesn't have to stop. You don't have to teach the listeners everything there is to know. You just have to make history or whatever your subject is bite-sized, palatable, even for the least enthusiastic listener. Now that you have, or if you've chosen to do a podcast, the next step is deciding what you want your podcast to be about. So there are a lot of different factors to consider, including relevancy, audience, sources, and public interest. So I think the first question that you need to ask yourself is, what do you want your podcast to do? Do you want it to solely educate? Do you want it to solely entertain? Do you want it to do both? If you are trying to educate, then what is it that your audience needs to be educated about? Is there any message you want to portray with your episodes? And the ever important question for any and all of our projects is, why is that information important? For Anthony and I, we wanted to tell stories. And at the Old Idaho Penitentiary site, we have started to create exhibits that feature the inmates rather than just the jail. And that's the thing is, when people come into the prison, they see the prison, they see the lockup aspect of it, the inhumanity of it. And so our podcast is about making inmates who are normally considered criminals human. It's so easy for people to come in and see the old cell blocks and see the solitary confinement cells and forget that the people who were in here were humans. They had families, they had people who loved them, they had jobs, they had lives. And so we believe that giving the former inmates a story gives them a voice they were not able to have before, and it allows visitors who've been to the site several times to learn even more. Again, once they leave, it's stuff they couldn't learn on the site. So this next point, again, is assuming that any podcasts you want to make are educational. So in the same vein, another way to help you figure out what you want your podcast to be about is to use materials that are not easily accessible to the public. And of course, that doesn't mean that it should be inaccessible to the public. But I think a really good podcast, and how Anthony and I have tried to make ours, not only tells a story, but it also encourages listeners to start research on their own if they want to. All the sources that we use in our podcast are either available on publicly accessible websites like Ancestry.com, or in our case, in the Idaho State Archives. And so we've encouraged our listeners to put in their own research at the archives, which anyone can access as long as they go through the right process. And so many of our museums and libraries have collections that are rarely accessed, or that some visitors might not even know exist. And so I think a podcast can help bring attention to those collections by making users aware of them, or by hearing our professional interpretation of them, and then encouraging them to take advantage of the collections on their own if they feel so inclined. As historians, librarians, archivists, curators, I think that there's nothing better than helping the general public learn for themselves. However, I think one of the most important aspects of finding a subject for your podcast is your passion for it. Sometimes you can fake interest in something for an extended period of time, especially in a medium like a podcast. But I think if you do that, it's just going to end up being another chore for you on top of your already busy schedule. And I firmly believe that your podcast should be work you actually want to do. So I think, working in museums and libraries and archives, and I apologize if some of our listeners, attendees aren't those things, but, we sort of all understand the excitement of a discovery. Finding that thing that you've been searching for forever, or finding something that no one else knew about, that is like, it's almost a high that can't be matched, at least for me, because I'm a giant nerd. And so I think being passionate for your subject and bringing that same excitement to your podcast is going to allow that same feeling in your audience. When you're excited about what you're talking about, what you've recorded, then your audience will be hooked, and they'll be just as excited as you are, and they'll learn just as much as you do. Every time I sit down to write an episode, I'm so thrilled to find new details and interesting facts, and I almost burst until Anthony and I can record. And we've actually had several audience members tell us that they've listened to the episodes multiple times and they learn something new every time. And so I think if you're really, truly passionate about something, and that passion can be easily encapsulated in an audio form, you should make a podcast about it. There are podcasts for almost every subject under the sun, so why not one about what you love? However, equally important to passion is understanding and finding your audience. Though Cameron and I are very passionate and excited about the 1987 Cher film Moonstruck, the demographic for a podcast about that would be very limited, and it would probably not be worth creating at all, though I have a lot of things to say about it. So the question is that you have to ask yourself is, who should my podcast try to reach? I'm not sure there's ever been a podcast in the history of the 550,000 created podcasts that has been interesting to every single person who has listened. So you have to figure out who you personally are trying to reach and how do you create content that will reach that audience. So for Anthony and I, we knew we had to gear our podcast to not just new visitors to the penitentiary, but to locals who had been several times. And, a podcast about Idaho and true crime, it kind of only appeals to a niche audience, and we had to be okay with that. People from Texas most of the time don't want to listen to a podcast about Idaho. And that's fine. We're never going to get the numbers of My Favorite Murder or Serial or insert your favorite big name podcast here, but I think Behind Gray Walls fits a very important role, and it's a local one. So if there's one thing I learned about Wyoming, and again, I apologize, not everyone here is from Wyoming, but when I was in Wyoming, I learned how much Wyomingites love their state. Idahoans are the same, Texans even more so. And so it's a local niche, this pocket that our podcast is fitting in. So for example, a quick search of the term Idaho in Apple's podcast app reveals only 15 podcasts directly related to the state, and only about half of them had recent episodes. Wyoming, as far as I can tell, only has about 10 podcasts directly about the state. And I found that local people want to know more about their state, even if they think they know everything, because as we know, they don't know everything. So if you can manage to exploit this statewide desire in some way, you have a really great chance of being successful. So our podcast, Behind Gray Walls, we've had about 25,000 listens in our first year, and nearly half of them are just from the state of Idaho. And so I think local is really key to small podcasts like ours and the ones that hopefully you create. However, you also don't want to alienate people from out of state. So I think a successful sort of quote unquote local podcast appeals to that small local audience, but can also find threads in that larger national one. And finding that balance is really difficult. So I think if you're working on finding your topic, ask yourself, if I was from Wyoming or whatever state you're in, would I find this interesting? Most of the time the answer is going to be yes. And so then the more important question is, if I'm not from Wyoming, would I find this interesting? And, in our podcast, Anthony and I got lucky because our site sort of already lends itself to being a subject of fascination for others out of state. And so making a podcast about inmates who served there was sort of natural. And so finding a topic for your institution may not be as easy, but I almost guarantee that you would be able to find one. So once you've decided that you want to do a podcast, as well as what you want your podcast to be about, your decisions are not over. In fact, the first several steps of creating content is just making a series of decisions dealing with sort of the format, how it's going to work, what it's going to look like. And of course, very few, if any, of these decisions need to be concrete. And I found that listeners are pretty forgiving if you change things a little bit. So before you can get to the fun part of researching, writing, and recording, you have to know how your podcast is structured. And so here are some of the decisions that Anthony and I had to make before recording even a word of Behind Gray Walls. So the first question is, how will we release episodes? Will we do a season of a certain amount of episodes and then take a break, or will we continually release episodes? If we choose to do a season, how many episodes will be in that season? How much time will lapse between seasons? And if we choose to do continually release episodes, will we take breaks after a certain amount? The next question is, how do we want to format the episodes? Will it be one person? Will it be multiple people? Will it be read from a pre-written script with very little chatter in between? Will it be more conversational? Do we want to use sound effects? How long will the episodes be? Those sorts of questions. Next, I think that is really important is, how will we engage the audience? Can we create and maintain social media accounts? How will we spread the word of our podcast? Do we need permissions from larger associations? So in our case, in Behind Gray Walls, we had to get permission from the Idaho State Historical Society. questions like that. And then, what editing program will we use? What hosting platform will we use? What apps will we post on? Do we have money set aside for hosting our website, or will that need to come out of our own pockets? Some of these questions are more technical, and Cameron will definitely be able to help you more with those than I can. I'm much more on the content side of my own podcast. So if all these questions seem overwhelming, don't worry. As I said, if you make one decision and after doing some recording and editing find that it isn't how you want to do it, you can make changes. Podcasting is a very forgiving medium, and you'll be able to adjust the two things that are or are not working without too much of a headache. But these are all very important decisions to know before you start researching and writing, because it will help guide the next steps. So now comes the fun part, actually creating the content. And a production schedule will certainly help with this step. I know Cameron has a production schedule slide in his as well, so all just things to sort of take into account. So admittedly, Anthony and I are less organized on the production schedule front, and it has almost come back to bite us several times. So ideally, if you do a season like we do on our podcast, you would want all of your episodes recorded before you start to release episodes. We don't do this like we should, and almost every season we end up recording the last episode like the week before it's released. It's stressful, and we do not recommend this. This may not be a problem for you if you're allowed to work on the podcast during work hours, but for Anthony and I, the podcast often takes a back seat to other work at the penitentiary or to my PhD classes. So just sort of keep that in mind with your production schedule. So as we all know, good research and writing takes time, and this needs to be taken into consideration when creating your production schedule. Obviously, I'm not going to lecture you about what good research means and what it takes. We're all professionals on that front. You know what good research looks like in your field, in your library, in your museum. But because we are sort of official, at least those of us from institutions, we are sort of like official libraries, museums, etc. We want to make sure that our information is sourced and accurate, and that takes time. So I would plan at least 20 plus man hours per episode between researching, writing, recording, and producing. So to give you an example of how much time this can take, in our most recent season of Behind Gray Walls, we are profiling the riots that occurred in the history of the Idaho State Penitentiary in conjunction with a new exhibit that's actually just about to open. So I was in charge of writing the episodes, and almost all of the research of the riots was done for me, and I only had to do some sort of preliminary research to put the riots in sort of a larger context. But even then, with about 80% of my research done, it took me at least 20 hours per episode to research and write, and our episodes are only about an hour long. And so that's going to, again, the length of your episodes is going to determine how long it takes, and probably the first season is going to take more than 20 hours because it just takes time to figure out your groove, figure out what you want, what you don't want. So you have to be, willing to take that time. But I think all the time that you put into it will result in a very good podcast that people will want to listen to. As museum curators and librarians, we want the public to get accurate information in an enjoyable bite-sized format. And so we need to do the legwork ourselves. I think if we're willing to go the extra mile to take the 20 to even 40 hours it takes for just one episode, it's going to be a reputable source for those looking for education, information, and entertainment. So as you can see, creating a podcast and creating content for a podcast is not a quick process. And there are two important keys to me that you should keep in mind while creating a podcast. So from the inception of Behind Gray Walls idea to its release, it took us around 8 to 10 months. So I think one of the most important keys to podcasting then is patience. I don't know about you, when I'm doing something I really love, I just want to share it with the world like as soon as I can. But I think rushing the product in this case can result in subpar quality. Anthony and I really had to remind me of this in the course of creating this last season. So we usually try to take no more than about 2 months off between seasons, but with COVID and the summer opening of the prison site, we had to take about 4 months off. But because we were willing to take 4 months off, I think it's going to be a really unique season that I'm even more excited about than I was sort of when we just had a few episodes written. So as hard as it is, I really recommend being patient and be willing to push things off if you need more time so that you can get a really good, really excellent podcast to the world, to your audience. So then kind of with that in mind, the second most important key to podcasting, in my opinion, is flexibility. Oftentimes with physical research and exhibits, mistakes cannot be easily remedied, nor do we have a chance to take audience feedback into account. But with podcasts, we can do both of those things. So in order to have a successful podcast, we not only need to be willing to fix mistakes, but we also need to be willing to listen to audience feedback and change things that might not be working for listeners, as well as make changes when we get something wrong. So, for example, in one of my podcast episodes, I, for whatever reason, said that normal schools were called normal to differentiate them from schools for like the blind and deaf, even though I knew that wasn't what they were. They're actually schools for like teaching future teachers. So when I heard that I had got that very wrong, I was able to insert a correction in the very next episode in order to get the correct information to our audience as soon as possible. And being flexible then is very helpful for us as producers, because if the production schedule or the formatting or another technical thing isn't working, we can change it and we can make a better podcast for us and for our listeners. So my recommendation overall, if you don't take anything away from my portion, which is fine, I would just say be patient and be flexible. So I will turn the time over to Cameron for the rest. If I can change presenter to him real quick. And so Cameron, I will hand it over to you.
And this is Susan. If I may interject for a second, if you have questions, please put them in the question box. They will be taken at the end. And with that, Cameron, it's all you.
All right. Thank you so much. Let me just select the screen I'm trying to show here. There we go. Once this gets loaded. So before I start, I just want to say thank you to Susan for inviting Sky and I both to come talk with all of you today. So again, my name is Cameron Green. I am the art show coordinator for Cheyenne Frontiers Old West Museum. And podcasting is not something natural for me. When I first started listening to podcasts, it was, I think Sky and I would drive to conferences across the country when we were in grad school. And she first introduced me to this podcast called The Dollop, which is not necessarily a reputable source for researchers, since it is two comedians that make fun of historical stories. But it was that podcast that really got me interested in the idea of, hey, you know what, this could be a really great way to make history accessible to everyone. And for me, accessibility is a big thing. And I think that everyone should have access to their history, have access to their cultural heritage as well. So when we were all shut down for COVID in March and in April, I started to think of how can we make the Cheyenne Frontiers Old West Museum accessible to everyone. Even though no one could be in the building, we wanted to make sure that people could come and experience what we had to offer. And so I got together with Mike Castle, who is our curator of collections here at the Old West Museum, and we talked about this idea of a podcast. And I told him that, I had this friend in Idaho who did a podcast, and it's popular locally for her. And so it was really great that he was willing to sign on to help out with this podcast idea. With this podcast, we decided that we were going to talk about the history of Cheyenne and Cheyenne Frontier Days. And the way that we decided to go about it was really hard at first, because we weren't sure what roadmap we were going to take in order to build this. So what we decided to do is, in the first season, we have decided that we are going to talk about the early history of Cheyenne and how do we get to Cheyenne Frontier Days in 1897. And so we've decided to break up our podcast into multiple seasons. Each season consists of 12 episodes. So we release one episode every month. And for Saddle Lore, it is really Mike who does the research. And so Mike will go and do the research. He does the 20 hours a week of research, the same as Sky and Anthony do for theirs. And he comes to me with the script, and then I help, and then I do the recording of it. And now sometimes in the most recent episodes that we've done, you can hear me talk a little bit in the podcast, but at no point have I done any of the research. And so what I am really doing is I'm attempting to be that audience member, that person who doesn't know anything about Cheyenne history. Even though Cheyenne is my hometown, my goal is to really ask the questions of what do I think people at home are maybe asking about this? Because sometimes the topics that we talk about are ones that I know have a lot of questions to people at home. And so how can I bring those questions into the podcast? And sometimes Mike and I do get off script, but getting off script and trying to talk through some of these more complex historical questions is really important. So what I'm going to talk to you in my portion of this presentation is how to build your podcast from a technical standpoint. Now, my background, I do have a certificate in audio engineering from the Musicians Institute. So that's where my love of working with sound really came into play, and where I felt I could be the biggest asset to trying to build this podcast for the museum. So the first question you need to ask yourself is budgeting. How will you fund your podcast? And the things that you need to consider, and one of the things I didn't consider at first until our director came and spoke with us is, how many staff hours does this consume? You know, for me, on the technical side of building the podcast, I probably spend about 10 hours every 2 weeks doing the technical portions. And some of the technical things I do is I edit, record, I go back and review what Mike has recorded and decide, hey, we need to go back and record this again. I work with trying to get the music on there. And I also do a lot of the promotions on our social media for it as well. If you guys have been on the Cheyenne Frontiers Old West Museum's Facebook lately, you'll see that the last few episodes have included hand-drawn cartoons that I've done, kind of to give a little bit of a teaser of what's to come in the episode. So I think that's a great way for us to interact with our audiences. The other thing that you need to consider when you're budgeting is technology and equipment. You know, what technology do I have available in-house already? And what equipment do I already have to start this podcast? But then you also need to decide, like, okay, is the stuff that I have good enough, or do I need to add things to it? The other thing you need to consider is grant/seed money. If you are in a position where you feel like I don't have the necessary equipment I need to do a podcast, then you need to figure out, like, okay, how much do I have to spend then to go out and buy the equipment I need? And that's something that we're going to get to here in a bit. I will tell you with Saddle Lore, Mike and I have built this podcast as a zero-cost podcast, and I will talk more about later in this presentation of how Mike and I did as a zero-cost podcast, but also making it so that in order to upgrade the podcast, we are using different channels in order to fund our podcasts that don't require us to take away from our day-to-day operation budgets. So, and one of the things is sponsorships. Sponsorships are a big thing when it comes to budgeting, whether or not it's you working with your local sponsors that you already have for your institutions, or monetizing your podcast through the hosting apps such as Anchor, SoundCloud, and Buzzsprout. And we'll get more into monetization later on as well. So Sky already gave you guys kind of a production schedule for content building, but I'm going to give you the production schedule that I give to Mike when I'm working out the technical side of it and how we need to get things recorded in the proper way. So how do I build a production schedule? First, you want to determine how many episodes a month do you want to release. You know, the more episodes that you release in a month, the more time you need to put into it. And I know that most of us here, we all wear different hats. And I know for myself, working the art shows, being an adjunct at LCCC, but also filling in for facilities, preparator, and various things around the museum, I don't have time to do an episode every week. But what I do have time to do an episode once a month. So Podcast production, as far as the technical side goes, takes about 2 weeks to complete. That's content creation, recording, editing, re-recording, editing, upload, and promotion. And the reason why I have sometimes you don't have to re-record. Sometimes the first time that you re-record the podcast, it's exactly what you want it to be. But I know a lot of times, I know the first time Mike and I recorded Saddle Lore, we were recording, and one of the stories that Mike had told, as we talked through it afterwards, you're like, wait, something doesn't match up in this story. And so Mike went back and checked the sources again and realized that like we had misread something in one of the sources. So we got together the next week and re-recorded that episode before it was launched in order to make sure that we had good and clear research in our podcast. So this is an example for the 1 month that we do here at the Old West Museum. So Saddle Lore is released every second Thursday of the month. And we release it every single time at 6 p.m. We're currently it's Mountain Daylight Time, but when we switch to Mountain Standard Time, they'll also come out at 6 p.m. The initial recording for Saddle Lore, we complete that the Tuesday, the week before the launch of the episode, and the script for that episode is due to me the Friday before recording. So usually Mike will give me the script on Friday, and I take it home over the weekend, and I read through it, make sure that there's no hidden surprises that I'm not expecting. It also allows me to create questions that I'm going to ask during the podcast as well. But it's also a good way of almost like a peer review. You know, as a historian myself, I have the ability to fine-comb my way through Mike's script because he does also provide sources, so I can go and check some of his sources and make sure that everything that we have is factual and that everything we have comes from a solid source. And then re-recording is, if needed, is done the Tuesday before the launch. So typically, by recording the Tuesday before, actually it's 2 Tuesdays before the launch of the podcast, it gives me that whole week then to sit down, to listen to the podcast a couple times, to go ahead and edit the podcast together, and then listen to it again before I decide that, you know what, we do need to re-record this podcast because either one, there's a technical difficulty, like I didn't like the sound that was coming through, or there was a statement that I had a little bit of issues with, or maybe the question that I was asking just wasn't there. And so a lot of times Mike and I will go back and re-record our podcast even after we recorded it the first time. And again, a lot of times when you're recording, you're going to think like, oh, we hit it right on the head the first time. But it's always important to be your own worst enemy and your best critic, because you are going to be the one who knows, hey, is this right? Like, does it sound good? And you need to be the judge of that. But I would say the most important thing of a production schedule is stay consistent. Listeners need consistency. So if you are launching a podcast, the second Thursday of every month, then you need to release it the second Thursday of every month. And you also need to make sure that it's coming out at the same time. If you're going to do 2 podcasts a month, then you need to make sure that they come out at the same time in the same days as you did in the previous months. Because the more consistency you can build, the more likely you're going to get those return listeners. It's kind of like social media in the sense that the more consistent you are of your social media, the more hits you're going to get on your website, the more likes you're going to get, and the more followers you're going to get. I know here in the museum, we have to stay consistent with everything we do, whether that's our branding, from the type of font that we use in our exhibits to the language that we use in our press releases to what we put out there in social media. So podcasting is kind of the same thing. You got to stay consistent. You want to stay consistent with your branding, but you also want to stay consistent on your schedule. If you're going to release it the second Thursday, you better release it on the second Thursday. So we're going to go through the technology. So these are broken up in 2 slides, and I kind of have 4 different tiers. of technology that you could use. So the first tier is what Mike and I are currently on. So tier 1 is that zero to minimal cost. And minimal cost, I mean, like you're spending less than $50 to get started on this project. So in tier 1, I'll be honest with you guys, we just use the voice recorder app on the cell phone to record our episodes. So because we haven't earned a lot of money yet on sponsorships, we're not at that point where we can go out and buy new equipment for the podcast. And this podcast, as some of you may know, launched in July of this year. And so we've been using the voice recorder app on the iPhone. And at first, when we first built the podcast, I was really hesitant to use that because I was like, I really want like a professional rig. Like it'd be great to have an interface with a condenser microphone to do this on. And then I thought about back to my days as a musician and how we would record our band practices. And we would always just put a cell phone out on one of our PA speakers and jam as hard as we could. And then at the end of the day, you could hear every single instrument through the voice recorder. And I thought, you know what, this is a great way for us to get going. Why not just use the voice recorder app? So what we do is we go ahead and record the whole podcast on the voice recorder app, and then I'm able to take it and throw it into the editing software, which is provided by our hosting platform, Anchor FM, which we'll get into in just a bit here. The second tier that I was kind of thinking of costs you about $100. And to use the second tier, specifically, you're looking for a USB microphone. You're looking for a USB microphone that is a vocal condenser microphone. And now, a lot of times when you're out there shopping for different microphones for your podcast, you're going to run into two different things. You're going to run into a dynamic microphone and a condenser microphone. A dynamic microphone is going to be very focused on the directionality of it. So if you are speaking into a dynamic microphone, you want it pointing directly at yourself. If you're using a condenser microphone, the condenser microphone will pick up everything around you. Because what it is, it's a cardioid pattern of a microphone. So it's going to collect all the sound from around the room. The one that I've listed here, this one is the microphone that I found on Amazon. It's a really cool little setup for you to use. It's just a USB microphone with a studio headphone set. And it is a condenser cardioid podcast mic. So these microphones are really easy. You just take them out of the box, plug them right into your computer, and you're good to go. You don't need an interface or nothing like that. But you will need some kind of app to record on. But most of us on our PCs or MacBooks, there is a voice recorder app that you can just plug your microphone into. Now, on, let's see here, tier 3 goes up a little bit in price. So tier 3, you're looking at $200, but you're also adding new equipment to it. Now, I will say that once you get to tier 3 and tier 4, whoever is running the podcast is going to have a little bit more technical know-how on how to operate some of these systems. Now, with the tier 3, we're looking at this specific example is the Rockville two-person podcasting recording kit with mic stands and headphones. This is going to be more of your traditional mixing board. So with these microphones that come with this specific kit are dynamic microphones. This is built for 2 hosts. So with the 2 hosts, if you want them to have their own microphone, definitely then you want to go with this tier 3, because now you're going to use 2 dynamic microphones and you're going to need an interface in order to mix those microphones together. And the Rockville soundboard will allow you to do that. Now, if we think back to that previous example I showed you for tier 2, the one that's talking about the condenser microphone, if you wanted to do 2 hosts on a condenser microphone, you absolutely could. Because that condenser microphone, again, is picking up all the sound from within the room. But with the dynamic microphones, if you are going to use a dynamic microphone to do your podcast on, then you're going to need 2 of them. Because you're going to need a microphone for every person in your podcast in order to get that clarity of sound. Now, the nice thing with the Rockville is that you are going to get a lot more flexibility as far as the way it sounds. When you go through and set your EQs and your preamps, you're going to be able to really get the timbre of each host's voice. Now, Mike and I have very different timbres to our voice. I have a little bit more of that deeper radio voice, whereas Mike also has a little like more that mid-range radio voice. Mike fortunately is definitely a face for TV as well as a voice for radio. So he has it really going for him, and he does a fantastic job though of with his pronunciation. And you really don't need a lot of EQ on someone like Mike, but there are people though that you might need to either fix the balance in the low pass, the high pass, or even in the middle ranges of the EQ. So something like the Rockville that has a traditional soundboard will help you do something like that. Now this fourth example is going to be very expensive. And honestly, these are kind of the setups that you would hear on some of those bigger podcasts, such as if you're listening to like the Dollop guys, or if you're listening to My Favorite Murder, or even if you're listening to Tripod. This is the type of technology they're using in those podcasts. So the first part of it is the Zoom H6. The Zoom H6 is kind of like an all-in-one recording device and editing device. You can do it all within the box, right from a little handheld device. It's no larger than probably the brick component of your charger for your laptop. It's that tiny, but it has a ton of power though too. So you're going to get a lot out of it. In that H6, you do have 4 ports that you can plug microphones into. You can EQ it right from the controller, and you can also edit it right from that controller as well. The other thing that you're going to need though in order to go with the set is that you're going to have to go out and buy separate microphones and and all equipment for it. So the one that I posted here, this is just one dynamic microphone, and it comes with it also comes with the windscreen, and the boom arm, and and an XLR cable. That's the other thing with the Zoom, is that you are going to have to buy legitimate cables in order to run this specific program. So you're going to have to buy XLR cables to plug into the Zoom. And it's the same thing with Tier 3. You're going to have to buy those XLR cables as well. And just to buy one kit of this microphone is going to cost you $149. So the price that I've listed for $626, that is the assumption that you only have 2 hosts. So you have the 149 plus 149 plus 328, which is for the newest version of the H6. So that's just a small, so these are 4 examples of different ways that you can build technology for your podcast. Some are more expensive than others. Sometimes you can like mix and match, meet somewhere like in the middle between 0 cost and Tier 2. Sometimes you can meet somewhere in between Tier 3 and Tier 4. But after Tier 4, everything just goes up in price. So you really have to consider, what do I truly need to get started? And I think for a lot of us museum professionals, a lot of us library professionals, sometimes the best answer is just trying to stick to the basics. If you can simplify it, great. If you feel that you do have the technical know-how to use the Zoom H6 or to use the Rockville platform, that's even better. That's great as well. But for me, I would recommend for a lot of people in this room to use the Tier 1, which is the 0 to minimal cost platform, or use Tier 2, where you just go out and get a USB microphone and everyone can kind of sit around that microphone and record the podcast together. So hosting. What is a hosting platform? So a hosting platform is, in short, it's how you get your podcast out there. So, after you record your podcast, now you got to get it online. Well, how are you going to get it online? So you need to work with a hosting platform, and you got to pick which one is right for you. Now, in my example here, I have 3 very popular hosting platforms. The first one is Buzzsprout. Buzzsprout is very simple to use. It's rated number 2 for new beginning podcasters. It has WordPress plugins, so I know a lot of museums and a lot of libraries do use WordPress to build their websites. So you can easily put a WordPress plugin that people could go onto your website and click and listen to your podcast. It's very easy to embed Buzzsprout podcasting into various websites, social media, etc. You can also build your own custom domain with them. But the limitations for Buzzsprout is that you are going to be limited to your bandwidth and your storage. You do get, I believe it's like a 6-month trial that you get with Buzzsprout, but after that, you're going to pay $12 a month, and that's only for 3 hours of content. So you're going to have to cycle out your content each time it reaches 3 hours. So if your episodes are an hour a piece, you're going to have to take down, every time you get to 3 episodes, you're going to have to take down an episode in order to get another one on there. The next one is SoundCloud, and I think, Sky, I believe you guys are using SoundCloud if I remember correctly. But SoundCloud is also another one that's easy to use. It's WordPress friendly, and you get free SoundCloud storage up to 3 hours of storage. But you can buy more storage, and those plans start about $6 per month. Now, the platform that Mike and I are using for our zero to minimal cost podcast is Anchor FM. So if you just go online to anchor.fm, that's how you're going to find the site. It's really easy to use. They have iPhone and Android apps that allow you to go ahead and edit from your cell phone or from a laptop. I know for me, sometimes I won't get around to editing a podcast till very late at night. So it's really nice for me to be able to lay in bed, watch TV, but also sit there and trim my audio on my cell phone. It's crazy, I know, but sometimes I need to be doing other things when I'm trying to relax. The other great thing of Anchor FM, you can record and you can save recordings, and there is also a sound library on the phone or on the computer. So a lot of times when Mike and I record things, it does save our recordings onto Anchor. And they also have a really great sound effects library, also a small music library as well that we use for intro music, that we use for different things throughout the pod when I can edit it into the podcast. But the great part about it saving previous recordings is that for our opening of the podcast, it always starts out with the following is production of the Cheyenne Frontier Days Old West Museum, a 501c nonprofit institution. I don't have to re-record that every single time. It's just automatically saved on Anchor FM's cloud, and so I can just pull it down. The other nice thing about that is that if you are doing monetization, you're going to have to record multiple ads for different groups that you are being sponsored by. And so being able to save those ads on Anchor's cloud is really big, because now, let's say you have Anchor one week, and then you have $5 Shave Club the next week, and then the week after that you have Geico Insurance, for example. The great thing is if it changes constantly, where each of those companies are taking turns, now you are at the point where well, I already have a Geico ad, so I'm going to pull the Geico ad. Well, now I need an Anchor ad, and I can just pull the Anchor ad. So you already have these all pre-recorded, and so that's one of the really great benefits of having that unlimited storage from Anchor's library. And again, Anchor does have unlimited storage. They also provide you with your own website. So our website for Anchor is anchor.fm /CFDOWM-SaddleWar. And that's how you can find our website on there. You can even leave a voice message on that website as well. So it's really cool. It's a great way for us to interact. I will say that there are limitations, though, to Anchor. One of the things that you'll notice on Anchor is that it does allow you to record directly to Anchor. But the issue is that it only allows you to record in 30-minute segments. And with 30-minute segments, sometimes if you're talking about a really exciting thing in history, I know when Mike and I did our podcast on early Cheyenne and about when the Union Pacific was coming to Cheyenne and how people were so excited for it to be here and that they were going to build these machine shops here, the steam shops were going to be here, and then the melodramatic hero of Cheyenne, Silas Seymour, decides to move him to Laramie because he's very upset about what the city of Cheyenne's done to his property. That's a very exciting thing to be talking about, and we did go over that 30-minute mark, and we were initially using Anchor to do that, and it didn't record. But what we were able to do is that we were able to then say, like, okay, let's go ahead, stop the recording, and we'll restart from the beginning. So that specific session was a lot longer because we realized that we went over time, but it was a good lesson for us. And so what we were able to do is that we then switched to the voice recorder on my cell phone, and we had unlimited time to record that. Now, once you are done recording on the cell phone, we were able to take that sound clip and upload it to Anchor. And then once it was on Anchor, I was able to sit there and edit it down. So these are just 3 hosting option examples that you could possibly use for your podcast. There are a ton more out there, and I highly recommend you go out and do your own research on them. If you just type in podcast hosting websites onto your Google search bar, you'll find it. So distribution. So what is the difference between distribution and hosting? So hosting, again, are sites such as Buzzsprout, Anchor, and SoundCloud. Now, to distribute these to places such as like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and I'm missing a couple there. But anyways, what you would do is you're going to distribute through those types of sites. Oh, Google Podcasts is the other one. So those are just examples of different sites that you can distribute through, and that's how people are going to listen to your podcast. Now, a lot of times on SoundCloud and Anchor, you can give them the website, and they can go onto the website and listen to it, but those apps aren't always friendly for people to be able to log in and listen to that podcast. But if you distribute it to something that is easily accessible, such as Apple or Spotify or Google, you're going to gain a lot more listeners across the board. So the way that this works is that Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts are functioning off of what's called an RSS feed. And RSS stands for really simple syndication. And essentially it is simple text files with basic updated information, news pieces, articles, that sort of thing. That stripped down content is usually plugged into what is called a feed reader, or an interface that quickly converts the RSS text files into a stream of latest updates from around the web. Now, when you go in to distribute your podcast to Apple, to Spotify, to Google, if you were on Buzzsprout or even on Anchor, they'll give you very detailed instructions of how do you find your RSS feed for your podcast, and then how do you upload it into their systems. For Spotify, you have to go onto a site called Spotify for Podcasters, and they have a very simple, 3-step method of how to get your podcast on the Spotify. I will say that when you do distribute your podcast on Apple, Spotify, or Google, there is a little bit of a delay between the RSS and your actual hosting website. One of the things I know I've ran into here is I've had volunteers come and ask me, like, hey, I logged in at 6 on Spotify and didn't see your podcast. Well, there is a little bit of delay. It's about a 15 to 30-minute delay. So sometimes that happens. And you just explain it to them, and a lot of times people are really understanding and will just log back in at 6:30 and listen to it. Or what you can do on your, or what you could do is for your distribution, when you decide, like, yes, I'm going to publish this podcast, just set it for 30 minutes in advance. So that way, if you want your podcast to come out at 6 p.m., you set your your published date for 5:30. So that way, when people log on to Spotify at 6, they're getting your podcast live that way. So there's just some little tips and tricks to doing that. And I'm not going to get fully into of how do you go through the RSS process. I think the instructions online through both Spotify, Apple, and Google are pretty straightforward. And if you guys need help, our contact information is going to be at the end of this presentation, and I will be more than happy to help any of you upload your podcasts to those specific sites. So record and edit. So this is a big part of what I do. So recording, it depends on the technology decisions. Are you going to go with tier 1? Are you going to go to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4? So if you're going to go with tier 1, which is the zero to minimal cost, you're going to need the Anchor FM app and the Voice Recorder app, both of which are free on your cell phone. So what we do is we record, Mike and I sit around our cell phone at the conference table, and we record the podcast, and then at the end of the podcast, I take it and I email it to myself, and then I'm able to upload it to Anchor. And then once it's uploaded to Anchor, I can edit either from my computer or I can edit from my cell phone. The other options that you have, and Audacity is a great option. Now, Audacity is something that if you have if you are someone who doesn't do technology very well or have a lot of the technical difficulties using computers or other types of software, Audacity might not be the right choice, but Audacity is a free option. It's an open source software. You just go to Audacity, just put Audacity into your Google search bar, and you'll find the program for it. The great thing of Audacity is that you are going to have a lot more control over your sound quality. So you're going to be able to sit there and you're going to be able to edit the sound quality with some of the free plugins that Audacity has, such as the EQ plugin, and they also have some like limiters, chorus sound effects, those types of things. The other option is a digital audio workshop, or DAW. So a DAW could be things like Pro Tools, PreSonus, Logic, GarageBand. If you're a MacBook user, there's a GarageBand on there, which can be used as a DAW. But also the Zoom H6 is considered a DAW because they do have a digital audio workshop built into that hardware for tier 4. Now, if you're going to go ahead and do, the tier 3, tier 4, one of the things you might consider is using a professional audio software such as Pro Tools, PreSonus, and Logic. A lot of times, a lot of these will come with a free subscription to PreSonus. PreSonus is kind of like really out there, and you can usually get it pretty easy depending on which microphone you pick up. I know, like when the Yeti microphones were a big thing, you could buy a Yeti and come with a copy of PreSonus on it. Logic is going to be Apple specific, so if you are on a PC laptop, Logic will not work on that laptop. You have to be on a MacBook in order to use Logic, and it's the same thing with GarageBand. Pro Tools is the quintessential audio recording DAW. It's what all your favorite musicians use to record their music. It's what recording studios are using. It's what all the movie studios use is Pro Tools. Pro Tools is a very advanced software. There is a large learning curve, I would say, to both Pro Tools and Logic. But if you are someone on a MacBook and have GarageBand, it's very simple to do. And even PreSonus is pretty easy to do as well. But my recommendations though is if you are just getting off the ground of your podcast and you're just trying to see like, okay, like what do I want to do? Like how's this going to sound? If you're just trying to test the waters and see what you like, I would start with just using the voice recorder on your phone, and then also using the Anchor app then to trim down those sound points and add sound effects, add ads, do things like that. So using a combination of the voice recorder app and the Anchor FM app, that's the way I would go anyways if you're just starting out. Now, if you decide like, okay, well, I'm getting a little better, I'm on tier tier 2, and I'm also, or maybe even if you're on tier 3, you could use Audacity for tier 3, I would say. And on tier 2 and tier 3, if you're using Audacity, Audacity is a great software. You know, especially if you don't have the money to buy Pro Tools, PreSonus, or Logic, Audacity is free. So Audacity is a great way to get your feet wet and mixing multiple voices. So let's say that you are using the tier 3 software and you have 2 microphones that are running. Well, now you need to mix those microphones together and make sure that you're able to fit the various pieces of sound into the right places. And Audacity is going to be the simplest way to do that. Because if you try doing that same thing in Anchor, let's say you import both of those audio files simultaneously into Anchor, that's going to be really difficult to do, to sit there, cut down, trim them, put them in order. But you could use Audacity to do that, and you'd be able to see the sound waves and be able to fit things together where they should go, and also give everything their own proper EQ. And finally, again, editing, we kind of covered that already when I spoke about the recording stuff, so I'm not going to go through that again. But again, you know, Anchor FM has really great, simple editing tools. Audacity, Pro Tools, PreSonus, Logic, and the DAW in Zoom, that's going to be a lot more complicated. So if you're just starting out, stick to the simple things, use Anchor, and use the voice recorder app. So sound clips and audio libraries. I know a lot of you are thinking like, okay, I'm going to start a podcast and I really want really cool intro music. One of the things to remember is like if you want to use your favorite songs, you'll need to go through the proper channels to do so. Your music choice will affect your budget and the ability to monetize. Don't rely on fair use. So fair use, as we all know, it's kind of the way that a lot of museums and libraries are able to use copyrighted materials in their exhibits because we are claiming that we're using it for educational purposes. I know as an instructor I do that as well, where I use fair use in order to show copyrighted things in the classroom in order to supplement the things that the students are learning. So these are the different sound clips, audio things that you're going to run into as you do your podcasts. So the first thing I want to talk about is royalty music. So royalty music is, again, like your favorite music. Let's say you want to use the new Taylor Swift album on your podcast. You're going to have to go through the process of getting a sync license. So you're going to have to get a hold of the publishing fees, which can cost you anywhere between $1,500 to $2,000. And then you're also going to have to get a hold of the master fees, which are anywhere between $1,500 to $10,000. So those are really expensive. That's easily going to break the bank on your budget. Especially, I know a lot of us are probably going to be starting with the grant from the State Libraries Association, which is $250, I believe. So you're going to go way above that if you do royalty music. Now, royalty-free music is a little different. So royalty-free music, some sites are subscription-based and others you pay per music or per sound effect. So the ones I've listed here, like Epidemic Sound, it's going to cost you $15 a month or $144 annually. And you're going to be able to download unlimited royalty-free music. With Artist.io, it's $25 a month if you want music and sound effects. Or if you just want the music, it's $16 a month. And the last option is AudioJungle.net. And on that, you're going to pay per music and per sound effect. That's probably the way to go for a lot of us because we're going to be able to find the ones we want. And again, if we're sticking to that consistency, you want the same music on it over and over again. For Mike and I on Saddlelore, we use the Frontier royalty-free music that's provided to us by Anchor. So the last option is hosting sound libraries. So places like Anchor have music that you can use and even monetize as long as you use the music that they are able to provide to you. I mean, a lot of these things are like 7-second clips, 30-second clips at the most. And then I did put a website down here, so if any of you want to learn more about like music royalties, this rainnews.com. This is a great like little article on how royalties work. And then that's all that I have for my portion of this presentation. I know I've gone a little over time, but as you can see on the screen here, Sky and I have provided our contact information. So if you guys have any questions on anything that we've talked about today, I highly encourage all of you to reach out to us, and we're going to be more than happy to do so. So Susan, I'll turn it back over to you.
All righty. Thank you. And wanted to give my contact information, and I know we ran long, but we have a couple of questions that I would like us to get to. If you are in a Wyoming museum, there is up to $250 in support to get your podcast, or if you came last week to our sessions, your virtual programs going. So please contact me. And then real fast, we're going to get to these last questions. How much time is realistic to build an audience? Do you have a number of listens for time spent to determine ROI?
I'll turn on my webcam as well just so everyone can see me. So realistically, again, if you're going local, I just don't think that we can expect big numbers. Again, I think our podcast, Behind Gray Walls, so we have, it's been about a year, so about 13 months, we've had 26,000 downloads, listens. SoundCloud sort of keeps our stats for us. We have a Facebook group that has about 200 people in it, and again, that's been about a year, but we do have the added advantage of we are the Idaho State, the Old Idaho Penitentiary is actually one of the most popular sites in Boise, and so we get sort of promotion just by people visiting the site, and so I don't know if how well ours has done so quickly is going to be the same as something much more local can expect, just because we have the added advantage of sort of having the promotion by people just coming.
Yeah, and for us, I think for our trailer that we put out, that has the most listens so far. It's at about 47 listens, I believe. We did just launch the trailer in June, so this is a very new podcast. I do think that the more that you push it out to the public, the more people are going to listen to it. And also because we all have physical institutions, at least most of us do, put it at your front desk. Advertise it at the front desk of your museum. Have your volunteers listen to it. Have them talk about it when they have visitors coming in to your institution. Or if you're at a library, the librarians can also talk about those types of things. So I think it's hard to gauge where your audience is. I know for me, I'm a big binger. I love waiting till the end of a season, kind of like with Netflix or Hulu, and then binging through a podcast, or waiting for a long road trip to listen to those podcasts. So it's like what Sky said at the end of her portion of the presentation. It's about having patience. And I think having patience with your audience is big too. But, again, stay consistent, keep putting it out there, and eventually it's going to pay off.
Yeah, and so when we started actually July of last year, so I'm about a year ahead of Cameron. And we were stoked when our first thing that we released hit 100, and I think that took a solid, month or so. But because we have been consistent, we've now released 3 seasons. We're releasing our 4th one right now. So we have been busy and we have been consistent in that, and I think that has helped grow our numbers as well. So I definitely would agree with Cameron to just be consistent with what you're releasing, and people will come if they want to listen.
Cameron, we have a request to show your contact info again, so I'm going to make you the presenter, and if you could put that slide up, that would be great, so people can see it.
Here. Oh, yep. I believe it should be up now.
Okay. Not seeing it just yet. Did you do show screen sharing?
Oh. Yeah, let me see here. Oh, it's paused right now. Let me unpause that.
Okay.
How's that?
I am still not seeing it.
Let me turn off my webcam maybe.
Oh, we have your webcam, Cameron. We don't have your screen.
Oh, let me turn off my webcam real quick. Maybe
Okay,
that will
there
work.
we got it.
There it
We
is.
got it.
Awesome.
And we've got a couple more questions here. What do you think, what are your thoughts on using a browser-based recording platform like Zencastr?
I think using a cloud-based recording platform like Zencastr is fine. You know, the nice thing with the cloud-based recording things is that you're not going to take up space on your internal hard drive. So it's a lot easier on your internal hard drive. I will say that one of the things that we've been going through, especially at this museum, is that we're currently working on our cybersecurity. So if you are uploading things to a cloud, I would just check with your IT support staff on your campus to make sure that you guys can use a cloud-based recording software such as Zencastr. For us, since we are uploading things to Anchor, we also had to go ahead and get that approval as well. So, you know, I think doing the online cloud-based uploads is fine. I would just double check with your IT personnel to make sure that's okay with your institution.
Okay, and we have just a couple more questions. Which voice recorder app did you use?
So the voice recorder app that I'm using, I'm going to switch to my webcam real quick so I can show you guys what it is.
Okay, and then what about voice recorder app on iPhone?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm using right now. So I just use the voice memo app. So as you guys can see here, I don't know if you guys see that. So I'm just using the voice memos. And that's all I'm using to record the podcast. I don't know. Yeah, so as you see, I've already started recording as we have been talking, but this is the app that I use here at the museum to record our podcast with. Sound quality turns out great. It's easy to email these recordings to yourself, or the nice thing with iPhone is that you can save, you can move the files around in your iPhone or onto your iCloud, so that way you can access it a little bit easier for Anchor to pick it up, or SoundCloud, or whatever you're using.
Okay, and I think with that, I'm going to put it back to my final slide. I think with that, we are going to conclude. Thank you all for hanging in there with us, those who hung in there with us. And if you have any questions, give me a call. As I said, if you are in a Wyoming museum, please contact me, and we may have some support for you to get your podcast started. I'd really encourage you to come to the Friday interactive session and keep an eye on our training calendar. We always have all sorts of training opportunities. And thank you very much, and we shall hopefully see you soon at another session.